its aims. Linda Burney is the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, and she's with me now in our Parliament House studio. Linda, welcome.
Hello.
Linda Burney, the takeout from this report is that Indigenous Australians should be consulted. Do you think that was the mistake at the beginning of this process when Labor established the Closing the Gap process not to have Indigenous people at the table?
Labor did establish the Closing the Gap process through that remarkable event in February in 2008, the apology. But the actual targets, when you go back in history, Patricia, were developed by Aboriginal people and adopted by Labor. It was a conference with many Aboriginal groups there that worked through the targets. I do welcome very much, as Ken has just said, the partnership between the Coalition of Peaks and the COAG in developing a new set of targets. But you can't walk away from the fact that there is almost no change since last year on the targets, and that is 2 are on track, the others are way off track.
Year 12 attainment and preschool education for 4-year-olds are the only targets on track. Are there lessons here that could be applied to the other targets?
I'm not quite sure whether there are. I mean, all the targets are very different. There is absolute necessity, as you said in your introduction, that unless the housing situation is sorted out, and the Commonwealth has walked primarily away from funding housing, then the other things that follow on, good health, good educational outcomes, child protection, health, are almost impossible to achieve when the housing crisis is as it is, particularly in rural and regional communities.
Targets around health, infant mortality and life expectancy are not on track. How much is this a function of the failure to address issues like housing and access to health services?
Well, it is a function in relation to housing and health services, but it's also a function of extreme poverty. Patricia, I've spoken to you before about some of the things that I've witnessed in communities around living conditions and lack of water, lack of clean water. Mums giving their babies soft drink because it's cheaper to buy soft drink than water in some of the stores. So those things do feed in, and so does history and the racism that's existed in the past. And you can't divorce those things from what we're seeing today, that sort of intergenerational poverty, that intergenerational passing on of the effects of things like the stolen generations. I know there's a lot of people out there on social media that will disagree with that statement, but it is the truth.
The Coalition of Peak Indigenous Organisations is optimistic about the Closing the Gap refresh. Do you see this as a potential game changer?
I have enormous respect for Pat Turner. And I have enormous respect for the Coalition of Peaks, and it is historic. It is our job as policymakers to listen to peaks and not just have the rhetoric of, we're not going to do what we've done in the past, and that is do to Aboriginal people and not listen to them. That has to be real. In my view, there isn't the time that Ken and the Prime Minister talk about. I think this is an absolutely urgent, there is an urgency around establishing the new targets and an urgency around trying to meet those targets. And that's going to require not just the federal government, it's also going to require state governments to work more collaboratively. And behind all of this, sitting behind all of this, Patricia, is that collaboration.
We'll see more targets, but crucially Indigenous organisations will be driving that strategy and delivering the services. Labor has been key behind this. What will you be looking for to ensure that this actually works?
In terms of the targets, do you mean?
Yeah.
We'll be looking to see that there is a justice target. I don't have to tell you or your listeners the dire situation for incarceration of First Nations people, we'll be looking for a target that is around the removal into home care of Aboriginal children, which is at a crisis level and ever growing in this country. And I hope there is a target around the issue of domestic violence.
The Minister, Ken White, upset some in his party room by saying that he wants a referendum on constitutional recognition held by June next year. The Prime Minister said something a bit different in question time. What do you make of all of that?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister, he has said this and didn't say it so clearly today, is not in favour of a constitutionally enshrined voice. He, I think, is ambivalent about a referendum, and time will tell. I mean, there isn't a lot of time in this term when you think about what's required to establish legislation to have a referendum. And in my view, this is also something that should be treated with some urgency. We can't go on and on and on, as Anthony Albanese said today, of listening to platitudes, listening to we've got to do this better, we're going to try harder. I said very clearly, Patricia, that we're not talking about statistics here. We're talking about aunties and uncles, brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, grandparents and cousins. These are real people.
The government has separated out the voice proposal from constitutional recognition. Does that suggest to you that what the government is considering here is symbolic mostly?
It does suggest that to me. We have said very clearly through our leader's speech today and statements that we've made in the past that Labor adopts the three elements of the Uluru Statement: an enshrined voice, truth-telling and agreement or treaty making, and that was made clear again today. I think where the government is heading is to walk away from Uluru as much as possible. That, of course, will find its own way and be resolved one way or the other towards the end of the year. But we have to listen to what people are telling us, and the Uluru Statement was a clarion call and clear on what is required. And I actually think, Patricia, that if we can have a voice to the Parliament, not to the government, but to the Parliament, that is having a say on what affects First Nations people, we will see a change in the Closing the Gap outcomes.
Thank you so much for joining us, Linda.
Thanks, Patricia.
Linda Burney, the Shadow Minister.